All our stories are created for entertainment purposes only.
I'm not sure if this is the appropriate place to share my story, so please let me know if it's not. This narrative revolves around my parents, with my dad at 65 and my mom just celebrating her 61st birthday. They've been married for 39 years and have 3 children, my sister, who is 38, myself at 36, and my brother, who is 33. Despite us all living in different places now, we've always maintained a close-knit family bond. However, earlier this year, our family's foundation and dynamics were shattered when we discovered that my mother had cheated on my father just 2 years into their marriage. To make matters worse, it was revealed that I am not biologically related to my father. Even though it's been over 7 months since I learned this, I still feel emotional just talking about it. In January, my wife and I, along with our children, aged 15, 13, and 10, thought it would be a fun project to create our family tree. My wife ordered DNA testing kits for all of us, including our parents. Everyone was thrilled about this idea, especially our kids and our parents. Looking back, my mom seemed to be the most enthusiastic, particularly eager to explore the data related to her extended family. Considering what eventually unfolded, it's baffling why she showed such enthusiasm, but I believe she didn't fully understand how these DNA tests operated at the time. Let me backtrack a bit. We received the testing kits in mid-January and collected our DNA samples the following weekend when our parents were visiting us on a Sunday. In any case, we received the results in late February, and my wife immediately noticed something was amiss. Although there was a clear genetic link to my mother, the report indicated no genetic connection between my father and me, or between my father and any of my children. We believed there must have been an error, so my wife contacted the company to report the issue. During the phone call, the representative conducted a quick check and verified that the results were indeed from the package we had submitted. Upon learning this, my wife put the call on speaker, and we explained our concerns, emphasizing that there had to be a mistake. We asked if the representative could double-check, and she agreed to discuss the matter with her supervisor and promised to call us back. Once we hung up, my wife jokingly remarked, "It seems like you might be the unexpected addition to our family." I laughed it off, but I couldn't help but wonder, what if it's true? My wife told me not to be ridiculous, but I sensed she too had some doubts by that point. Later in the afternoon, the representative called us back and reiterated that everything was accurate. She mentioned that she had contacted the lab personally, and the report was indeed correct. After ending the call with the representative, my wife and I sat there staring at each other in shock, our mouths hanging open. My emotions were in turmoil, and I began to speak irrationally. My wife helped calm me down, and we discussed our next steps. We decided not to take immediate action and agreed to contemplate the situation further, as only she and I were aware of the results at that point. Coincidentally, or perhaps ominously, during dinner that evening, my daughter inquired about the test results. I exchanged glances with my wife, and she informed our children that we had received the results, but there was an error, and they needed to be rechecked. Later that same night, while talking to my parents over the phone, my mother posed the same question to me, and I responded with the same explanation we had given our children. The following days were challenging as I couldn't stop thinking about it. I grappled with whether to confront my mother and hear her side of the story, or to approach my father first and discuss how he wanted to address the situation. I even contemplated keeping it to myself, knowing that once I revealed the truth, our lives would be forever changed. While that seemed like an appealing option, it wasn't feasible because my family members were anticipating the results, and I couldn't bear to keep that secret. I kept delaying the conversation, and with each passing day, my anxiety grew. Eventually, my wife persuaded me to approach my dad first and then decide how to proceed. She believed it was the right thing to do, and I concurred. So, on a Saturday, we drove to their house. I was incredibly nervous, and my anxiety reached such a point that I had to pull over after a few minutes of driving, allowing my wife to take the wheel for the remainder of the journey. Upon arriving at their home, my nerves continued to affect me, but oddly enough, when I saw my dad, I became remarkably calm. After some initial chit-chat involving the 4 of us, my wife took my mom to the farmer's market and then to lunch, leaving my dad and me to continue our conversation. As soon as the ladies departed, and it was just my dad and me, I couldn't delay it any longer, so I told him right away. I said, "Dad, We received the test results from the genealogy company. He responded, "That's great. Do you have them with you?" I replied in the negative and went on to explain that there was an issue with the results that I needed to discuss with him. He looked at me with a blank expression. I proceeded to explain that the results indicated there was no genetic connection between him and me. He wore a puzzled expression and asked, "What do you mean?" I clarified that the results suggested that we weren't biologically related. He let out a small chuckle and questioned if there must be some mistake. I replied, mentioning that we initially thought the same, but the results were verified by the laboratory. He inquired if the tests had ever been inaccurate, and I informed him that the company assured us they were nearly 100% accurate. The expression on his face at that moment is etched in my memory. I could sense that he was becoming emotional, and he stood up, breaking the tension. I walked over and embraced him. Tears welled up in his eyes, and witnessing that, I couldn't hold back my own tears, something I hadn't done in 25 years. After regaining my composure, I asked if he understood the implications, and he nodded. Once more, he hugged me tightly and reassured me that I was his son, regardless of the genetics, urging me to stop crying before he started. I had anticipated this would be his reaction, but hearing him say it was an immense relief. He's always been my hero. He inquired if Mom was aware, and I told him no. I wanted to speak with him first and discuss how he wanted to handle it. He expressed his gratitude for my approach and mentioned how much it meant to him. Subsequently, we delved into the discussion of how and when we should approach Mom upon her return. Following that, I called my wife to inform her that I had informed Dad, and it was time to break the news to Mom. My wife inquired if I wanted her to return quickly, but I advised her to stick to the lunch plan as I desired more time with Dad. While we waited, Dad and I continued our conversation and grabbed a quick sandwich from the kitchen, as our appetites were quite diminished at that point. When my wife and mother returned, the three of us sat Mom down, and I delivered the news. She appeared stunned and repeatedly asked me to clarify what I meant. My wife and I provided a thorough explanation, but she continued to insist that she didn't comprehend. She insisted that we were both crazy and making no sense, going back and forth with her denials. Eventually, she suggested something along the lines of, "Well, if there isn't a match, you must have been switched in the hospital." My wife interjected, stating that this wasn't the case because the report indicated a direct genetic match between my mom and me. At that point, I believe my mom realized she was cornered and began to cry. She left the room, and my wife followed her. We could hear their conversation, and after several minutes, my wife returned, informing us that Mom still insisted there must be a mistake. My dad then went to speak with her, and we left them alone for a substantial hour and a half before I decided to check on them. Upon entering, I sensed the tension in the room. Dad reassured me that everything was okay and that he would be out to talk to me soon. When he emerged, he shared that Mom had admitted to having an affair around the time of my conception, but still insisted that my dad was my biological father. She refused to disclose the man's name, claiming it was irrelevant and too far in the past. Hearing this, my emotions welled up once more. Witnessing my reaction, Dad pulled me into a tight bear hug, reminiscent of the ones he used to give me when I was a child, flooding me with nostalgia. Seeing us embrace brought tears to my wife's eyes, and Dad hugged her as well. I was surprised by how well he was handling the situation, but I could sense his deep disappointment with Mom. My wife and I believed it would be a good idea to spend the weekend with them. However, when I mentioned this to Dad, he insisted that we return home as he wished to have a private conversation with Mom. He assured us that everything would be fine and said he would call if he needed our assistance. We left that evening, but I ended up calling him multiple times that night to check on the situation. The following morning, we spoke again, and he informed me that Mom was still unwilling to disclose the name of the other man. He mentioned that he had decided to stop communicating with her until she did. My wife brought up a valid point, emphasizing the importance of obtaining that information for medical purposes. Dad mentioned that he had already conveyed this to her, but she seemed determined to have everyone forget about it, considering it meaningless and unimportant. Dad expressed his desire to inform my siblings and asked me to arrange a teleconference. I scheduled it for later that morning and specified that it was for adults only, so they assumed it was related to the kids. When they discovered the purpose of the call, they were just as shocked and disbelieving as the rest of us. During the call, Dad reiterated his love for me and assured them that he was holding up okay. After the call, each of us individually contacted Mom and urged her to share the information, primarily for the well-being of her grandchildren. Unfortunately, she continued to refuse, expressing her desire for us to forget the matter because, in her view, it was inconsequential. Despite apologizing profusely to Dad countless times since he found out, she adamantly refused to provide any details. Later that afternoon, Mom called my wife and expressed her concern that Dad had grown frustrated and left the house, ignoring her calls. She asked me to reach out to him, believing he would answer my call. During the conversation with Mom, my wife once again emphasized the importance of disclosing information about her affair partner. While she didn't reveal the man's name, she did inform my wife that the man had passed away. She argued that since he was no longer alive, there was no need for anyone else to know, and she requested that we not share this with her grandchildren. My wife clarified to her that the deceased status of the man didn't change the importance of having his information for potential hereditary conditions. Mom, however, remained steadfast in her refusal and became increasingly agitated as my wife persisted. I called Dad and had a conversation with him. He assured me he was okay and mentioned he needed some time away from her to cool down. Later that day, my sister arranged a call for the three of us along with Dad. During the call, she proposed that we all undergo DNA tests to confirm my results and ensure they matched Dad's genetic profile. I anticipated Dad might object, but he was fully supportive of the idea. Consequently, the following week, all of us underwent comprehensive DNA testing conducted by a national laboratory. The process was convenient as there were local labs near each of our residences. We received the test results a week later, which confirmed that my sister and brother were indeed Dad's biological children, but I was not. While I felt relieved to receive this confirmation, it still made me feel like an outsider, especially since the identity of my biological father remained unknown. Once again, Dad reassured me and lightened the mood with a joke, stating he wouldn't trade me for $1 million, perhaps $2 million, but not just one. That's just his nature. He's simply a delightful person to spend time with. The day following the DNA results, I phoned Dad and informed him of my plan to drive over the next morning and spend the weekend with him. He advised me not to come since he was leaving for the Gulf Coast in the morning. He and Mom purchased a property there last year and intended to eventually sell the family home and relocate. He retired about 2 years ago after nearly 44 years of work and began receiving his first Social Security payment in January, right before everything unfolded. I inquired if Mom was aware of his departure, and he confirmed that she knew and was quite upset, but he expressed his need to distance himself to contemplate his next steps. I completely empathized with his situation, yet I felt deeply sorry for both of them. He conveyed that he had informed Mom that he wouldn't communicate with her until she disclosed the man's identity. Furthermore, he mentioned that even if she did reveal the information, he was uncertain about remaining in their relationship. I was taken aback by this abrupt change in his disposition, given that he had been handling everything so calmly up to that point. He explained that after a week of her tears and apologies, he had reached a breaking point. Well, his strategy proved effective because that night, Mom had a breakdown and confessed everything to him. She recounted how she had an affair with a man who owned the laundromat in the town where they rented their first apartment. She used to visit there weekly to do laundry since they didn't have a washer and dryer. He was divorced and lived above the laundromat, and that's where the affair occurred. Mom explained that she engaged in the affair because she was feeling extremely down about herself at that time, and this older man was giving her attention and saying all the right things. She was about 24 years old then, while the man was in his late 30s with teenage children. Mom insisted they were together only a few times and she ended it with him. She swore that she never saw or heard from him again since that time. She revealed to Dad that 6 years ago she came across his obituary in the newspaper, and that's how she learned of his passing. She maintained that this was how she found out and assured Dad that she had never given him a second thought since ending the affair. While she took no joy in his death, she felt a sense of relief when reading his obituary, thinking that the secret she had carried for all those years had died with him. However, fate had different plans. Even though Mom made a complete confession, Dad left for Mississippi the next morning and has been living there by himself for the past 4 months. Mom is emotionally distraught and feels lost without him, as he's been the center of her world for over 40 years. Regardless of her past actions, I know she loves him more than anything in the world, and this situation is deeply affecting her. She calls him every day, and he talks to her, but he's told her that he's not ready to see her yet. He's also mentioned that he's uncertain about whether he wants to remain married to her, but he has told us kids that he doesn't plan on getting a divorce at his age. He simply needs time and doesn't want to be around her for now, and he may never want to again. While I fully support his decision, I have mixed feelings about it. I believe Dad will manage on his own, but I'm concerned about Mom's long-term well-being. She's essentially alone in our hometown and rarely leaves the house. She appears visibly distressed and has lost a significant amount of weight. She has expressed her willingness to do anything to make amends with Dad, but he remains uninterested in reconciling at this time. Personally, I'm in a better place now, but it feels like there's a cloud hanging over me. One of the most challenging things I had to do was share this news with my kids. They were deeply upset, especially my eldest son, who had always taken pride in being his pap's first grandchild. To reassure them that everything was okay, I took my family to visit Dad for a week-long vacation, and we had a wonderful time. Since then, the kids have been doing well, understanding that he loves them just as much as before. I also recently reconnected with my half-siblings. My half-sister lives in Illinois, and my half-brother is in Indiana. They're both in their late 50s, with grown children and grandchildren. When I told them about the affair, they weren't surprised, as they had never had a strong relationship with their father. They were raised by their stepfather from a young age and consider him their true father. In fact, they didn't even attend their biological father's funeral. However, they did provide me with valuable information about a potential health risk in my biological father's family: heart disease. My paternal brother had a heart attack at age 48, my biological father died of a heart attack at 68, and his father also had a heart attack at 42. As I conclude, you might wonder why I decided to share this story. I did it to clear my mind and as a cautionary tale for people with children who might be contemplating infidelity in their marriages. My advice is simple: don't do it. The damage you cause will reach far beyond you and your lover, impacting your families for the rest of their lives.
Hey, I'm Jennifer, and I'm 40 years old. My husband, Michael, who's 43, is splitting with me because I did something really terrible. Here's what happened. I was at an office party with my coworkers, and we were all celebrating our success in hitting our targets this year, actually going above and beyond. We were having a blast, not a care in the world. I had told my husband that I might be coming home late, and if I had too much to drink, my work buddy Stacy, who's 35, would give me a ride home. Somewhere along the way, I started flirting with every good-looking colleague or company affiliate. I was doing it without any shame, and I couldn't remember the last time I felt that desired or touched that way. My husband and I weren't close anymore, no more touching or even talk. It was about 2 hours before we left the party when things got heated in the bathroom with one of the affiliates. Let's call him Frank, who's 33. Frank and I had some wild act in one of the bathroom stalls, and it was incredible. I couldn't stop myself, and we kept going for another half hour until we heard someone in the stall next to us. We quickly pulled ourselves together and promised to meet again to finish what we started. I went home, but all night I couldn't stop thinking about Frank, and I even pleasured myself next to my sleeping husband, thinking about him. I felt guilty, but having Frank's number made it even more exciting. We texted constantly for the next 3 days and decided to meet up the following weekend after the party. This time, we'd be at the hotel suite he rented for a 2-week stay in town. I was more excited than nervous because I was finally getting some attention again, all in the same week. I wasn't really thinking about how Michael would react if he found out. Pretty silly to think he wouldn't, right? We spent the first few hours together, having dinner, talking about work, flirting, touching, and playing footsies. It was getting steamy and I couldn't resist it, and before I knew it, we were both without clothes. It was different, and we did it more than once, and it felt amazing. The next day, I woke up in a panic because I hadn't told my husband I'd be spending the night out. I found 3 texts and 10 missed calls from him. I quickly got dressed and headed home at 7 a.m. luckily finding my husband still asleep. I changed into my pajamas after a shower and tried to sleep beside him without waking him up. Unfortunately, I only got about 4 hours of sleep before he woke me up in a rage, demanding to know where I had been all night. I explained that I had gone to Stacy's after a late final meeting at work, and we worked on some Excel sheets while having a few drinks until we both passed out. I also told him that as soon as I woke up, I rushed back home to avoid worrying him further. He was understandably upset that I hadn't informed him about staying late at work or going to Stacy's place. But I convinced him that I was swamped with work and couldn't find the time to call and let him know. Surprisingly, he bought that explanation, but I had a feeling he wasn't entirely convinced because not long after that, I got caught red-handed. 2 days ago, I messaged Frank to meet up one last time before he left town, and he agreed, but it had to be in a public place. So, I told Michael that I was going out to dinner with Stacy and one of the affiliates to finish up some work papers and get a contract signed. I had it all planned out, even telling him the name of the restaurant we were going to, though I had no idea how he would react. I left work early to go to the fancy restaurant where he had sent me the location. Stacy and I were having a great time, kissing and flirting, when suddenly, after about an hour, she burst in, grabbed my arm, and explained that Michael had called her, asking if I was with her at that restaurant, and that he was on his way. I hurried outside with her, and there was Michael. He asked us where we were going, and we said we were heading home. Michael grabbed my hand and questioned me about where I had been the previous Saturday. He mentioned that Stacy had tried to cover for me when he asked if I had stayed at her place, but it seemed like she had no clue about my whereabouts, not that Friday night or tonight. At that moment, Stacy told him about the office party night out of guilt. She said she saw me leaving the bathroom with Frank, looking more than just friendly, but she didn't know any more than that. Michael immediately took the conversation to the car, telling Stacy to go home. He bombarded me with questions, wanting to know how many times it had happened before and after that night, and if it had happened that day in the restaurant's bathroom. He was relentless with his questions, and I swore that the first time was at the office party when I was wasted. However, he wasn't convinced it was the only time and accused me of lying. I had to confess that it had happened more than once, and that I had slept with Frank the previous Saturday. He slammed the steering wheel in frustration, yelled at me for being stupid, and said I had ruined the only good thing in his life. After that, we drove in complete silence. When we got home, he locked himself in our son's old room and talked to his friend Albert all night. After I got into bed, he came to our room and told me he wanted a divorce. He said he'd keep the house because he believed I didn't deserve to live in the home where we built our family for the past 19 years. He also said not to tell our son since he's dealing with college exams, and he'd let him know when the time was right. I didn't know what to do. Michael wasn't talking to me, and the last time we spoke, he told me to either get a mortgage for an apartment through work or rent one using my savings. He wanted me out within the week. I'm completely lost. I texted Frank explaining everything, and I needed someone to help me find a solution. Frank offered to rent a hotel room nearby for a week until I found a place. I agreed, but told him to wait for me to call him once I finished packing. Even when I was losing everything, I turned to someone else. The same person who's causing me to lose everything I had built with Michael. My life. I'm now in the hotel room Frank rented for me, and Michael hasn't said a word to me. I'm searching for places to rent, like a cheap room, until I can secure a mortgage for a house. I've tried contacting Michael so many times, but it seems like he's turned off both the landline and his phone, or he's blocked my number on both. I'm feeling so confused. Should I start a new life with Frank, or should I try to mend things with Michael? I called Stacy and asked her why she revealed our affair that night. She said she felt guilty about being part of it without knowing, and that she's a terrible liar. She wouldn't have been able to keep it up even if she had known beforehand. I tried going back to our place, but it looked like no one was home, and the blinds were strangely closed early. I just don't know what to do. I'm still texting Frank. He's been there for me during this tough time. Currently, I'm renting a van in a somewhat upscale trailer park. a place I wouldn't have found if Frank hadn't rented that hotel room. It's not what I expected. Not as bad as I thought, but not super nice either. Adapting to this new life has been a struggle. It's been a month since I moved out, and Michael hasn't reached out. However, my lawyer contacted me, saying that Michael has filed for divorce, and the papers have just arrived at her office. I think this is the end for me and Michael. Our 19 years of hard work and sacrifice seem to be over. I've lost my family, and I'm anxious about how our son will react. I'm sure he'll call me when his dad tells him, but I don't know what Michael will say. Will he accuse me of cheating? I'm terrified that my son will hate me. I hope Michael does right by me and keeps our son out of this mess. The only thing that keeps me going in this life right now is the thought of seeing my son again. I couldn't bear it if he looked at me with disdain. I just couldn't handle it. We've been married for 16 years. In the first 8 years, I had 2 different affairs. Now I realize I was wrong, and my husband didn't do anything to deserve that. After my last mistake 5 years ago, we decided to end things, but it turns out we couldn't stay away from each other. We spent a year trying to make our relationship work, and then we had our daughter. At that point, he wanted me to stay home and take care of her. I wasn't really okay with it, so I kept working. Then our son was born, and he asked again. So I decided to do it, thinking I'd go back to work after a year. But that didn't happen, and now I'm at home with both of them. I love my kids, but I also want to get back to work. However, I feel like I can't ask for it because of my past mistakes. I'm a completely different person now. I've been through a lot, and so have my kids, and I would never cheat again. I've learned my lesson. Please be brutally honest with me because I've been struggling with this for years. I need some objective advice. Nobody around me knows what I've done, so I have no one to talk to about it. How can I open up and have this conversation? I never thought my workplace could be a place for cheating. I knew the people I cheated with from way back, before I even started my career. Plus, they don't even live in the same city as us anymore. Financially, it doesn't make sense for me to be at home, as daycare would cost only about a quarter of what I make. We've actually lost money with me not working. But if it gives him peace of mind, it seems like the right choice. I do plan to go to therapy on my own once I start working again. That's one reason I wanted to go back to work since our insurance doesn't cover it. But after reading the thoughts in this thread, I think I'll find a low-cost option and wait a little longer before returning to work. I understand why I cheated. When we got married, I had unrealistic expectations that no one could meet, and when you add in his human imperfections, I messed up. There are things I wish he had done differently, but that doesn't excuse my actions. I foolishly listened to 2 people who told me what I wanted to hear. I don't blame my husband. My infidelity is my own fault, and I know it wasn't just a mistake. It was a huge wrongdoing. I'll carry that guilt until the day I die, which is why I say I'll never cheat again. But I also know that you should never say never. That's why I'll seek therapy when I start working again. I know you mentioned ending things after the second one, but there might be other reasons behind that decision. If he's aware and still chose to be with you, then he kind of has to accept your decisions until you're no longer in a relationship. Unless you cheated with coworkers, in which case it's a different story. Honestly, neither of you should be in a relationship right now. You betrayed him twice, and he shouldn't have forgiven you unless he saw you making a real effort to change. But you can't isolate yourself at home just to make him happy because it will take a toll on your emotional and mental well-being, and that's not good for you or the kids.